In today's video, we are going to discuss renting versus buying a home, and we're going to talk about which one is actually cheaper. Hi everyone, my name is Helen. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, we're going to discuss renting versus buying a home, and we're going to specifically look at which one is actually cheaper. So let's just start. The first consideration when it comes to buying versus renting a home is actually the cost of buying a house. Now, when it comes to the cost of buying a house, there's multiple factors that you need to consider. Buying a house has a 20% down payment on average. You're generally going to need to pay some kind of homeowner's insurance. You might need to buy some extra insurance for specific concerns that may arise. You're also going to need to pay for the maintenance yourself. So you have to take into account that maintenance costs can be between 2 and 3% a year on average. Maybe you might need to replace a roof, you might need to replace some windows, you might have other costs that arise over time. And the other thing when it comes to buying a house is that you have closing costs, you have a lot of additional fees that you may overlook when you're looking at comparing it to renting. So you really do need to take into account that when you buy a home, there's several different costs involved in that. If you do put less than 20% down on a house, you also need to buy private mortgage insurance, which is an additional cost in that particular scenario. And it doesn't apply to every single homeowner, but it is something to consider if you're thinking of buying a house for, let's say, 10% down or 15% down, or really anything less than 20%. So keep that in mind when it comes to the cost of a house as well. And one other factor to consider when you are buying a house is that you will also be responsible for the taxes on that home. Taxes, of course, vary by state, so the amount that you can expect to spend in taxes really depends on where you live and what the state tax is. But keep in mind that that is one of your responsibilities as a homeowner. Now, when it does come to buying a home, you have a couple of benefits there. So you do have a benefit when it comes to building equity in the house. So equity is basically money that you're putting back into your own pocket. It's your net worth that is growing when you build up your equity. So that is one factor to consider when it comes to buying a house that can kind of offset some of the costs. And you can also take into account that when you buy a home, you have opportunity benefits as well. So maybe you buy a home at a low cost and then later you can sell it at a higher price. So there's also that opportunity. You also can potentially rent out a house if you decide to move and you don't want to sell that house. So you have rental opportunities as well. The second point when it comes to comparing the cost of renting versus buying a home is the cost of renting itself. Now, when it comes to renting, it's much more simple and straightforward when compared to buying a house. You have a very specific price. The price is whatever it is that you agree to with your landlord. Now, one thing you have to consider when it comes to renting is that sometimes you will have additional costs involved. Maybe the landlord has certain charges for, let's say, water or other utilities. But generally speaking, whatever cost you guys agree on, that's what you're going to be paying. So there's no hidden fees, there's no hidden costs, you don't have closing costs or additional expenses. Some landlords may require you to have renter's insurance, but that also varies by landlord and it depends on who you're working with. So if you're working with a larger company, you will often need renter's insurance as well. But some of the smaller companies or individuals who are renting out, for example, a house or maybe a small apartment, they may not require renter's insurance. It really just depends on the landlord. One of the things that you should take into account when it comes to renting is that you have a very straightforward process of paying for that. So you don't have any additional costs, you don't have maintenance, you don't have a lot of unexpected expenses there. It is one simple cost. Now, renting does also offer a lot of flexibility. So if you are thinking that you might have to move, or maybe you're thinking that you don't want to live in this area for very long, you aren't necessarily sure that you're thinking of buying there, maybe you don't feel comfortable buying there because you're planning to leave in a few years. So it gives you a lot more flexibility in that regard. When you're renting, you can rent for a specific time frame and then you can move to a different location if you don't like that area. As a general rule, renting is usually less costly when you live in a major city and less costly in certain urban areas. So you should take that into account when you're comparing the cost of living for renting versus buying a home. Depending on where you're living and what location you're in, the renting cost may be cheaper or it may not. It really just depends on location. The third thing that you need to consider when comparing renting versus buying a home is the length of time that you plan to live in the property. Now, generally speaking, renting is cheaper when you're looking at short term. So if you're planning to live in a property for, let's say, 5 years or less, you're probably not going to have any benefit by buying a home when compared to renting, simply because there's a lot of initial costs involved with buying a home. You have to have 20% down, you have closing costs, you have other expenses associated with the process of buying a home. So your initial upfront costs with buying a home are often quite expensive when compared to renting. Now, if you are planning to live in that area or that property for more than 7 years, maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm going to be here at least 15 years, maybe 10 years, whatever your plan may be. Or even if you're thinking this is your forever home and we are not planning to move again. Well, in the long term, when you're looking at more than 10 years, generally speaking, buying a home is going to be cheaper in most areas. Now, that is not true of every area. When you're looking at certain urban locations and specifically large cities, that may not always be the case. However, generally speaking, if you're looking at a long time horizon of 10 years or more, then buying a house may be a cheaper option. The fourth consideration when you are looking at buying a home versus renting is really the downsides that come with renting. Now, when you are looking at renting, there are some potential downsides to consider. The first consideration is that you are kind of at the mercy of your landlord. Once your initial lease is up, let's say you've signed a 2-year lease and you are now ready to sign another lease, the landlord can increase the rent by a significant margin in some cases. They will usually increase the rent according to whatever the current market value is. So sometimes that can mean you have a very large jump, and that's not ideal if you're wanting to keep your expenses low. Now, generally speaking, there's not a lot of landlords when you're looking at larger apartment complexes that will jump it up very high, very suddenly, but it is something that a landlord is legally able to do. So you should keep in mind that you're at the mercy of the landlord when it comes to your price. Your price is not locked in. It's not going to stay the same every single year. You will see your rent go up slightly every year, generally speaking. Now, the amount that it goes up can vary, and you can expect that sometimes it's not going to go up very much and sometimes it'll go up a lot. It really depends on location. It depends on your landlord. There's a lot of factors there. But generally speaking, renting will result in a higher amount over time. So 1 year you may pay one amount, the next year you may pay another $100 on top of that. So keep that in mind, that you don't have that locked in price that you would have with a mortgage. The second downside of renting is really pretty simple. You don't have as much freedom to do with the property what you want. So if you want to paint the walls, you have to ask your landlord if that's an option. If you want to do certain things, you have to ask for permission. So that's another factor when it comes to renting. My final point when it comes to this topic is really just my own take on this. So when it comes to renting versus buying a home and finding out which one is cheaper in your specific location, it's really a matter of calculating all of the details. So if you're thinking of buying a home and you're trying to see if it's going to be cheaper to buy or it's going to be cheaper to rent, you really need to take into account a multitude of different things. So the first thing you need to do is calculate how much are you actually paying in costs that you're not going to be getting back from buying. So what is your interest rate and how much are you going to pay in that? What is your insurance rate and how much are you paying in that? What are your taxes? What other additional costs may be involved? So if you have to pay for private mortgage insurance, how much is that going to add on top of whatever else you need to pay? So the only way to get a fair comparison over which one is cheaper over the short term or the long term is to compare the price of the rent versus the price of all these additional costs that come with a house that you will not get back. So of course, whatever you're putting into your mortgage and you're getting equity, that's great. But if you are paying a similar rate to your rental costs with your interest rate, with your insurance rate, with the taxes and all the other costs involved, then you maybe want to take a step back and think about whether or not it's actually cheaper to buy. In some cases, it's not. In some cases, it is. It really just depends on where you live, what your interest rates are, and what other factors you have to pay for in that particular location. So it is something that you will have to calculate yourself for the house that you're considering. But generally speaking, I would say for the short term, rent is usually cheaper. And for the long term, buying is usually cheaper. It depends on how long you plan to live in that location. That's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe and I will see you in the next one.